Go to the bathroom.
Oh, you're very kind.
I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you all for coming. It's lovely to see such a turnout. I'd like to welcome our undergraduate students. I'd like to welcome colleagues from University of Victoria and from Vancouver Island University who have been supportive of this process all the way through. I would like to welcome Dr. Stephen Kemmis to Victoria and to the University of Victoria. We're looking forward to your talk that was entitled something, but it's now entitled
Something else.
On the Theory of Education, Practice, Architectures, and Ecologies of Practice. I would also just like to take a moment to acknowledge the Lekwungit and Wasanich peoples on whose traditional territories we are working within today. And I would like to just take a moment to turn it over to Dr. Wanda Curran from the Dean's Office to welcome you as well.
Thanks, Kathy. I do want to welcome everyone, and I also want to thank Kathy and Tim and Helen and Stephanie. Sorry, I should say who they are. Dr. Kathy Sanford, Dr. Tim Hopper, and actually Dr. Rhonda Nixon also was involved in, at first, trying to get Dr. Kemmis to come here while he was in this part of the world. And then through our research office and Dr. Helen Raptis and Stephanie Helm, we were able to work things out, and with the help of the Dean, we now have Dr. Kemmis here today. So I just wanted to thank also the people who were involved in this. Being in the Dean's office, I now get to see how things happen and behind the scenes, and there's a lot of people that work towards getting something like this to happen. So welcome Dr. Kemmis and welcome everyone as well, and thank you.
Thank you.
So just before I turn it over to Dr. Kemmis, just a couple of words about his work, which I'm sure he will update you on because he continues to do amazing work around the world. But we're very, very fortunate to have Stephen coming to University of Victoria. And as I said, I'm really thankful that you took the time to come from Vancouver on your way back to Australia to pop in to Victoria to speak with us today. Dr. Kemmis is currently an adjunct professor and strategic research leader in the Research Institute for Professional Practice, Learning and Education, or RIPPLE, at Charles Sturt University, Wagga Wagga campus, New South Wales, Australia. He is recently retired as a professor of education in the Faculty of Education. And he is known for many of us who have been working in educational research over the years for some of his texts, including Becoming Critical, Education, Knowledge, and Action Research that he authored with Wilfred Carr, the Action Research Planner that he authored with Robin McTaggart, and more recently, Enabling Practice, Challenges for Education, co-edited with Tracy Smith. He's currently researching the nature of professional practice. It's probably been part of what you've been doing for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
He's been very involved in critical participatory action research as a professional learning approach in schools. And hopefully we'll hear some of his stories and some of his experiences as he talks, but he can say it much better than I can, so I'll get out of the way and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you very, very much indeed for having me and for making it possible for me to come over here at such short notice because I was just on my way back home from Alberta, so I was just passing through. It was fantastic that it was able to be organised by Rhonda. I was going to talk about the history of schooling before and to talk about the contemporary struggle for education, and I thought I will be talking about some of those things, but I'll talk about it in a slightly different context, because what I wanted to do was to try and present you with what I've been working on just lately, which is a theory of educational practice. Educational practice is, well, first about practice. Practice is the opposite of theory. Oh, Tim. Oh, I see.
You're good. Keep going.
Keep going. For most people, practice is the opposite of theory. It's self-evident. But when people talk about practice, they talk about different things. And I want to introduce some different perspectives on practice to try and make it more problematic and hopefully to say something new about it. But who knows? It will work, do you think, Tim?
Yeah, you got it. Next. Click on the picture.
Click on the picture. Anywhere on the picture.
Yeah.
Anywhere on the picture.
Click. That's it.
That's all. I'll talk about those things. A little bit about perspectives on practice. I won't talk about critical participatory action research, I don't think. About practices and practice architectures, this theory we've been developing, about how education is constructed out of practice architectures, how practices relate to each other in ecologies of practices, and how practices travel. These are a lot of things to talk about. If you find it boring, please fall asleep very noticeably and I'll do something else. But if you want me to stop... It's very interesting, Tim. It's... This could be a problem. We'll see.
Okay.
I'm just hoping that some of the later pictures will be... Anyway, we'll get there. We'll have the problem when we have it. So, when we think about practices, the 7 blind men with the elephant, you know, one feels the trunk and says it's whatever, and one feels the leg and one feels the tail, and they all think different things about it. But different traditions study practice in different ways. Some look at practice in a dimension of the individual and social. Is practice about what individuals do, or is it about social structures? And an objective, subjective dimension. Is practice... Just by the way, if you're enthusiastic about taking notes, by all means take them. The pictures are going to be so complicated soon that it will be impossible to keep up. So anybody who wants to can have a copy of the overheads because they've got very complicated pictures on them. So there's an objective and subjective dimension. Do we see practice from the external observer's perspective or from a subjective internal participant's perspective? So putting those two dimensions together, here's 4 different views of practice. And so some people see practice as individual behaviour. And when I was studying behaviourist psychology at Sydney University 1,000 years ago, that's often the way practice was understood. Practice is sometimes seen in terms of social structures, in terms of social interaction, in terms of, and today, for example, soft systems theory. Some people see practice as intentional action on the individual side, shaped by meaning and values. Some see practices as shaped by discourses and traditions. Historians often see practices in these sorts of ways. But I like to think that we needn't be locked within just one of those, that we can try and see practice from both kinds of perspectives, and that we need to, when we're collecting data about practices, to try and collect data about all of them. Now, in the research industry, we're used to digging deep in one of those boxes, seeing practices through one of those windows only. But practitioners in classrooms are seeing practices from all of these perspectives all the time. And they're thinking about practice from all of these perspectives. What is he doing in the classroom at the moment, staring out the window? I'm looking at his behaviour. How is his behaviour changing because it's a windy day, or it's coming on to lunchtime, or because he's with those other boys? And then how does he understand what he's doing at the moment? And how is what we're doing shaped by the languages we speak and so on? We see practice from all of these different perspectives when we're, I mean, for example, if I see myself as somehow related to John Dewey, I have in mind ideas of progressivism, ideas about individuals and so on, that come to me as a progressive theory of education. But the person who's doing classroom practice, research in their classrooms, is constantly reconstituting. I bet not fall over that. Constantly reconstituting their practice in the light of seeing it in these different ways, seeing what individuals are doing, seeing how the class is going, trying to see it from participants' perspectives as well as their own, trying to see how we've been shaped. If I want to be a Freirean, I'll have to give up lecturing. But just to keep going with this, so here are some of the research methods that are typically used by people who see practice from these different kinds of perspectives. If you think of it as individual behaviour, you're going to be likely to be using quantitative methods, observational techniques, tests and so on. If you think of practice as social, you might be using sociometry and measuring who likes who in a classroom. Some versions of systems theory, some versions of ethnography see practice very much from the outside. If you're interested in seeing practice the way practitioners see themselves, this is interesting, Tim.
I know, I can't get the lights down.
I think it must be the
Projector.
projector, I think.
Pause in a moment, I'll have a quick look at it if you have a discussion. I'll try
But if you want to see how practitioners or participants in practices understand themselves, you need to talk to them, or they need to tell us from self-report and so on. And if we want to understand practices in this way, we read historical documents that about how their practices shape policy documents, things like that. But if you want to try and do all of those things, perhaps you work on critical participatory action research. Now, let me see. I'm going to move on to another section. So we just have a quick try to see whether... maybe just go on, let me go on a bit here. Tim, if I can go on a couple of slides. Oh no, this is going to be... Uh-oh. Just see if we can get that. I don't know what I'm doing with these pictures on that. Where did these pictures come from? Oh, you've got into... Oh dear, we're talking about the tango now. The tango is a practice. The sun never sets on the tango. These pictures are all from the websites of tango clubs around the world. But the tango emerged as a practice in the 1800s. Here's a picture of some men dancing and playing the tango about 1900 in Buenos Aires. The men used to learn to dance with one another so that when they got good enough, they could dance with women and sweep them off their feet. But until then, they just had to practice with each other in the street. And here they are in 1950s, a milonga, a social dance in Buenos Aires. Here is Carlosito Gardel. I was just in Toulouse recently and was reminded that Carlosito Gardel was born in Toulouse in France. He died in a plane crash, and in between his birth and his death he was very famous for singing the tango. And down there is Astor Piazzolla, who was the bandoneon player, and he drew together classical tango music with jazz themes and produced the modern tango that we know and love today. Here, ladies and gentlemen, are some tango clothes that you can buy. If you buy from Noose, you can buy eco-friendly tango wear, it says on the website. The tango has a whole way of being associated with it, and I'm going to just talk about that in terms of practices. Practices like the tango are or classroom education are distributed among participants and over time, orchestrated and not just in the obvious musical way in the tango. They're internally diverse and differentiated. Different people have different roles. Different people, the man does something different from the woman, etc. And they're ecologically dependent on other practices. I'm going to talk about practices in terms of those things. But practices are also made up of sayings, doings and relatings. Now, if you were in, I don't think I can see anyone in this room that I was at Plato's Academy with in 387 BC. But back then, we used to study logic, physics and ethics. And the reason we studied logic, physics and ethics was to speak well and think well, to act well in the material world, and to relate well to others. And why do we want to do those things? In order that we would live well. So you studied these things not in order to study philosophical discourse, as we understand philosophy today, but in order to live a philosophical life. And a philosophical life, lived by any of the great four philosophical schools of those years, had this aim, to teach you to live well. You, in this case, by the way, was an aristocratic young man. No women, no slaves, sorry. But you were studying these things in order to live well. But the sayings, doings and relatings are, I think, characteristic key parts of practices. Practices are interconnected, have sayings, doings and relatings all as part of them. But these categories, sayings, doings and relatings, connect up with well-known theories. For example, the ancient theory of Benjamin Bloom about how we're to understand the world is divided up in the cognitive, the psychomotor and the affective, links up with the sayings, doings and relatings. And if you happen to be a Habermasian like me, you think of the world in terms of the great social media of language, work and power. If you're a Bourdieuian, you see the world in terms of cultural and symbolic fields, economic fields and social fields. I think these categories, while I won't say they're foundational, they are three important dimensions of the world in which we meet ourselves, meet one another, three important intersubjective realms. Now, these sayings, doings and relatings that our practices are made of, I'm going to be saying, are distributed among participants, orchestrated, internally differentiated, ecologically, and I'm going to talk about how some of that happens in relation to the tango in a moment. This tango is a great example. If you think of a practice just in terms of its sayings or its doings or its relatings, you tear it apart. Every practice has a project, a purpose. If I say to you, what are you doing now? And you give me an answer, you told me the project of what you're doing. And that project holds, I'm giving a lecture or giving a talk or something, and that holds together my sayings, my doings and relatings. So I'm talking to you about the content of this slide, I'm wandering about, pressing buttons about the slide, moving the slides on and so on, and I'm relating to you in this very unnatural way. But as I say, the sayings, doings and relatings are also to be found in these three intersubjective realms. We meet one another in language, in semantic space, we meet one another in activity and work, in physical space-time, spaces like this. We meet one another in the medium of solidarity and power, connectedness in the dimension of social space. So these sayings, doings and relatings are parts of three intersubjective dimensions of our social life: the semantic, physical space-time and social space. Now, for example, the tango has a whole language of its own. Here are some words in the tango language. Look down here, the practica. They also are interested in practice. So the tango has a language, sayings that are associated with it. The tango has doings that are associated with it. Just in this, I'm not doing all of the lunges and all of those things that I wish I could do. Here I've just taken some styles different styles of tango have different patterns of movement, and people move in different ways in different kinds of tangos. Oops. But think of the relatings. The two dancers, they need also the musicians. And are they real tango musicians, or are they just jobbing musicians who are here tonight, and tomorrow night they'll be back with the symphony orchestra or the pop group or whatever? We need the costume makers, we need the shoemakers, we need the people who build the floors and make the nails and so on and so forth. For the tango to exist, we depend on a whole lot of other social relations around it. So the relatings around the tango are not just the two people dancing, or the two people dancing and the musicians, but a whole lot of other social relations that make the tango club possible, for example. And the same is true of the school. So here I wanted to say that a practice, this lovely practice of the tango, has its own language associated with it, it has its own ways of doing things, and it has particular patterns of relationships. Now, of course, you recognise immediately that I'm talking about Marx's third thesis on Feuerbach, which, and oh, don't sing it out altogether. Marx said, he said men, I'll say men. The materialist doctrine that men are the products of upbringing and circumstances, and that changed men will therefore be the product of changed upbringing and changed circumstances, forgets that it is men who make circumstances and that the educator must himself be educated. Pardon the sexist language. But it is people who make circumstances. And so we are constantly remaking and making the circumstances in which we meet one another. It wouldn't be a university, would it, if we didn't have rooms like this? We've been making rooms like this, not for as long as you'd think, but from probably about 1734, when the University of Glasgow invented the classroom. It invented the classroom because they wanted to speed up the production of Presbyterian ministers, and so they decided to teach the first class separately from the second class and from the third class, instead of having all 3 years of the degree taught together. And so they made a room for the class, for each class had its own room. And of course that was an advance on the monitorial system, where we had the big hall and someone sitting up the front, and in front of us was all of that furniture, the forms, and some people sat in the first form, and some sat on the second form, and some sat on the third form, and so on through to the sixth form. And when they sat on that form, they would get up and they'd move to the end of the form, and they would stand around a kind of banner where they would have lessons, and they would have to learn to recite the lessons that were on this banner, or standard. And when you had met the standard for the second form, you could move to the third form. These things, form, standard, class, classroom, all language that we've inherited. 1734 was the classroom. By 1834, multi-teacher, multi-classroom schools were being built. When I visited northern Saskatchewan 20 years ago and went to Indigenous communities up there and looked at the classrooms, I could have been in northern Australia seeing exactly the same things. A is for apple, B is for ball. The classrooms looked exactly the same. Could have been in Sydney, could have been anywhere. It's like a cancer that spread across the whole globe. The multi-teacher, multi-classroom school. So we come to a world of teaching already made for us, in many senses, in its language, forms, classes and so on, made for us, but also made for us in terms of these shapes. Here, ladies and gentlemen, I'm extremely disappointed in this. It's a podium. Once upon a time was up on the wall here, it had gold on it. I used to stand up there and you'd all be down here and I'd speak and profess. I was a professor. I needed to have that because I had to read you or talk to you about all of the most important books. And since you didn't have any books, since people couldn't afford books, I had to just tell you what was in the books. And so I'd profess, and I'd lead the recitation, and you would recite. And those were the good old days. And then the pulpit came down to the floor, and up went the tiered lecture theatre. So one thing we have to have in a university is tiered lecture theatres for professors to profess. And we have to have professors, don't we? So the professors have to keep talking. So we have to keep providing podiums, or podia, I suppose they are. These are also part of our history, part of the history of what makes a university, part of what makes the relationship between a professor professing and an audience eagerly listening and writing down. Now I want to fill out this picture about how we are made by circumstances. And so that infinity sign is going to stay in the background. So I'm saying practices are interactionally secured in sayings, doings and relatings that hang together in projects, but also in my dispositions as a practitioner. And that... Did anything happen then? No. We are meeting one another in intersubjective spaces. Our sayings, doings and relatings happen in those intersubjective spaces. And that we depend on the cultural discursive arrangements, the class, the form, the words that we use, the material economic arrangements, the way we use space and objects and pens and paper and so on, and how we meet one another in social political arrangements, the teacher and the students, a relationship that was only professionalised, according to the French historian Jacques Le Goff, with the formation of the university from the town schools, first in Bologna in the year 1088, when we began to have a profession of teaching. But so I depend on these arrangements already being available. If you were all to speak French, I'm not going to have very much to say to you. We depend on sharing a language. We meet one another in this physical space. We meet one another in this set of social relations. And so, for example, with the tango, we have tango people speaking a language of the tango. They can sing the tango songs, for example, but they depend on those songs existing. They come into those songs, they step into them, they step into the dance, they step into the language of the tango. We meet one another also in physical space. They dance, they play the instruments and so on, but the instruments have to exist. The music has to exist. The traditions have to exist. And they meet one another in a social space, relating to one another and meeting in places devoted to the dancing of the tango. And the same, of course, with schools. But in one case, they're meeting in order to dance the tango and to live the continuing tradition of the tango. But it's the same with education. Sorry about this. So this is a theory of practice architectures. Practices are held together by arrangements that hold them in place. If we want to have other practices, other modes of teaching, we need to have other practice architectures to hold them in place. Think for a moment about Australia, where curriculum and education are a provincial responsibility as they are in Canada. But we have, via clever moves by the federal government, we now have a national curriculum coming in the years 2013, 2014. So we'll have for the first time a national curriculum, national professional standards by which teachers are going to be judged, and national testing to see how well children do in terms of the national curriculum. It's like we stepped into Doctor Who's telephone box and we projected ourselves back 100, 150 years to the industrial era, where we want to have, to meet the demands of the 21st century, the most standardised curriculum one size fits all, the most standardised curriculum, because 150 years ago in Australia, we were wanting to send education out from Sydney into all of the areas around New South Wales, and we wanted to have equal quality education in every place around the state of New South Wales. And so we had to have people taught exactly the same things by teachers prepared to teach exactly the same things. And here we are in Canada, which, like Australia, teeters up at the top of international rankings about education through the program for PISA, Program for International Student Assessment. And here we are sitting right up the top there and terribly anxious that we're plummeting down because Shanghai goes in above us or whatever.
Finland, that's
And poor Finland's off the top now. They've been. I would do a lot of work in Finland. They've been staring at the chasm for all these years. They've been knocked down to second place. There's an end to their greatness. Of course, statistically, we're no different from them and no different from you. We're all only different in terms of order in the scale. Statistically, we're all very much like one another. So here we are in Australia with a national curriculum, standards and so on, and with a standardised curriculum at the very time you would think the only way we can do well where we are on the top of those scales is by becoming more sensitive to difference, to diversity, and meeting the needs of people whose needs are not being well met. So this is a time when you think we need the most flexible of curricula rather than the most standardised of curricula. This is a time when we want to be trusting teachers to do research into their own teaching in order that they could reach their own students better rather than just doing whatever the boss is murmuring over their shoulder and so on. So this is the theory of practice architectures. If we want to change practices, we need to change the practice architectures that hold them in place. Now, I know that all of you are constantly talking about definitions of education, and I don't want to have an argument with you here, but this is mine. Just by the way, I think it's rare these days to encounter definitions of education. I feel rather proud of this. Education, properly speaking, is the process by which children, young people and adults are initiated into forms of understanding that foster individual and collective self-expression, modes of action that foster individual and collective self-development, and ways of relating to one another in the world that foster individual and collective self-determination, and that are in these senses oriented towards the good for each person, which is what we seek as a teacher, our version of do no harm, the good for each person, and collectively the good for humankind. Now, on the side of the good for humankind, education policies are becoming less and less articulate, I think. We're good at talking about education and the good for each person, what we want educated people to know, what we want people to know when they leave school, but we're not so good on what we want the good for humankind to be like. Now, I didn't choose these words idly, self-expression, self-development and self-determination. I chose them from, yes, now you recognise them, Iris Marion Young's book, Justice and the Politics of Difference. Iris Marion Young says there are two forms of injustice. One is the injustice of domination, the other, the injustice of oppression. Domination consists in structures and practices that unreasonably limit self-determination, and oppression consists in structures and practices that unreasonably limit self-expression and self-development. So this theory of education is oriented in part by a theory of justice. And so it's got a view of what the good for humankind is, which is trying to free us from those constraints rather than we have an answer to the question. When asked what is the good for humankind, the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre wisely answered, "The good for humankind consists in the pursuit of what else and what else the good for humankind consists in." So all we can ever do is be searching for it. And anybody who's found it has only got a temporary answer. We need to go further than that. Now, heading in the direction of the theory of practice architectures, here's that definition of education. Education is initiation into forms of understanding, modes of action, ways of relating on the side of the individuals, education for living well, and on the side of the social, the world we share, the good for humankind, education to build a world worth living in. When that man loaded that video and made it available on the internet that led to that outrage in the Muslim world about the insult to the Muslim religion, he was exercising his rights to self-expression in ways that were incompatible with the right of other people's rights of self-expression, bringing about that terrible, terrible calamity and all of those deaths. This view of education that says we need to understand what it's like to build a world worth living in is, for me, a crucial part of why we're building a theory of educational practice. So this puts everything together. This is the picture you weren't going to ever be able to write down. So education is initiation to forms of understandings, modes of action, ways of relating, sayings, doings and relatings, that are supported by arrangements that we hope will become, through education, through people being educated, ones that are going to reduce injustice in the world. So this is putting together the theory of education, and a theory of practice. I'm pretty tired now. Comments, questions? I'm going to press on, but...
Give you one comment. This is from Deborah Britson, who reminded me of her presentation. She was here 3 years ago. And she had the premise of how do you educate children to take responsibility for a world they didn't create. I found an interesting parallels to a world worth living in. So sometimes putting the two things together.
It's and we also have always inherited, yeah, exactly her point. We've always inherited a world that we have to remake, as it were.
Just when you mentioned the two forms of injustice in the world based on dominance and oppression, it got me thinking about the new form that I've thought quite a bit about recently is the paralysis of institutions in changing, in responsiveness, and whether that is an overt form of oppression or dominance, or if it's based on some of those same considerations, but that lack of injustice in institutions to respond to the changing needs of people is a culture in itself, kind of at times the culture of no, at times it's the culture of self-preservation. I'm curious where that fits within the world sometimes, because I think it's growing all the time.
I agree with you. For me, there's some answers to that question in terms of Habermas's theory of system and life world, a topic for another day perhaps. But institutions build these arrangements, and we have to work within these arrangements. But if we think that we have these tasks of education of students for living well, and education for a world worth living in, we can keep trying to do those, as it were, no matter what the arrangements. We can make arrangements within those arrangements. We can meet one another, even though we do so in rooms that are given, in pulpits that are given, and podia that are given, and so on. We can nevertheless work against those structures towards these things. But the really difficult part is the life world part that says only when we think about the person and the good for each person and how we meet one another in terms of the good for humankind only when we recognise that we are connecting with people. And that's, of course, the genius of Max Weber's bureaucracy that was going to be able to deal with everybody in a way that was kind of depersonalised and so on, hierarchical, efficient. And Max Weber sang its praises as the most efficient of forms of human organisation. And now we live, you know, then we had the organisation man and so on. We come to understand ourselves as if we're nothing but representatives of organisations and not first and foremost human beings. And that's why people come into education, to meet other human beings. They don't come into education in order to be turned into robots that teach. They come to meet and work with and connect with other human beings. And so this project is to me something crucial. It's crucial in all parts of our social life, but it's crucial there too.
I agree. You actually, I think the smaller communities of practice that are working together to enable the change is one of the few real options to move forward at times.
Well, let me just tell you about one in education that I've been very enthusiastic about, education for sustainability. What I'm trying to show here is that education is always moving, and partly always moving, in relation to social movements. And as climate change and so on becomes a massive theme for us in the contemporary world, people are interested in forms of education for sustainability. And so they're inventing new forms of language. We're talking a new language of thinking green or whatever, and we're developing discourses of sustainability very, very rapidly, theories about sustainability and much more elaborated science. We're doing different kinds of things in order to act green. We're changing the way we use the resources of the world, and we're envisaging a sustainable material and a material world. But also, we're thinking about new ways of relating to one another and such values as intergenerational justice, where education is playing a role in that new social project, not just of living in a green world, but saving the planet. I mean, well, at least saving it for human beings. The planet will survive human beings, I'm sure. But education is playing that role. So when I go and do a study of education for sustainability as an emergent practice, I went to a school in Bathurst, in Western New South Wales, where they were doing revegetation projects. So they're developing new ways of thinking about restoring degraded landscapes, and they're learning new discourses. And learning new discourses about, and I say to them, why are you planting those Casuarina Cunninghamii there? Well, those are the ones that grow near the water. How do you know that those are the right ones? Well, we went and talked to people at the university and they told us that they are. So they're interdependent. The people who are doing this work are having to learn from one another about what's the right language to speak. They're doing different things. They're collecting seeds. They're growing these trees to plant. They're building shade houses to do it in. They're going out and into the community and planting them and raising people's property values by replanting degraded landscapes and building, they hope, new habitats. They're relating to one another in the world in different ways and relating to one another and other species differently, and hopefully they're establishing and securing more sustainable ways of living in the world. So education is participating in these social movements, and it seems to me that education is often at its strongest when it's at the cutting edge of these social movements about helping to make change. So that's that. That's back to the theory of education. I'll just speed through this and finish up. You've had enough of this, I'm sure. Yeah. You don't just get practices by themselves, they come in ecologies. I'm really interested in the idea that practices are living things. A practice like the tango. Unfortunately, I think they're only like living things. I've tried to convince myself as hard as I can that they are in fact living things, but I think they depend on human beings and other animals and things for their motive power, that they can't be dissociated from the people who carry them. So I can't convince myself that they exist entirely without us, although like the tango we can step into them and take them up. But practices travel. Here's the tango. Here are some of the things that are necessary for the tango. People to do the dancing, people to play the music, people to learn tango, people to have tango clubs, people to teach the tango, etc. But ever since the middle of the 19th century, we've had to have this whole complex of practices. Schools doing teaching of students are at least, well, we can find them in 600 BC. So that's in the Western tradition in Greece. So 2,600 years of schools. But when in the 19th century we wanted to have mass schooling, these other institutions needed to be created. We needed teacher education to provide the teachers and continuing professional development. We needed state education departments and education regulations and laws and curricula and so on that would be about what would be taught there. And we began to need mechanisms of educational research and evaluation, inspectors of schools and so on. Now, this whole cluster, these things, these new three things here, they all emerge in about 40 or 50 years in the end of the 19th century. State education departments principally, then teacher education institutions, initially run by states, and then in the universities. Although people have been talking and thinking about pedagogy for hundreds of years, it wasn't until the last decade of the 19th century, only a few minutes ago, that people started really thinking about what knowledge should we teach teachers. And there's a battle between two people. In the 1890s, Alexander Bain, a Scot, and John Adams, an Englishman, were the first two professors of education in Britain. Alexander Bain thought that what we taught teachers should be guided by the new sciences, psychology and sociology, that were just then emerging. John Adams thought people needed to learn philosophy and history and should study what the great educators had thought about education. So these two schools of thought, still battling it out today, emerged then. In the United States, it was Dewey who took the Adams position, philosophy of education, 1897. Please get it off the web and read it. My Pedagogic Creed. He was 40 when he wrote it. I wish I'd written that. Its language is sexist, it's out of date in some ways, but its vision of education, 1897, complete, what is it, 30 pages long, something like that, astonishing view of education at the turn of the century, a view of education as connected to democracy. So here's Dewey representing in the United States the Adams school of thought, philosophy and history. And then, in the United States especially, Thorndike comes along and others before him, but Gardner before him, but Thorndike in particular, becomes a version of the Alexander Bain view that education is only educational psychology. And those two battle it out through the 20th century. The historian Ellen Cunliffe Lagerman, Lagemann, says that in the history of education in the 20th century, Thorndike won, Dewey lost. You could say that's the case. But I don't think either side ever lies down. I think the struggle between them continues to go on. So this whole complex of practices arises, these are all new from the mid-19th century. These ones have been going on for millennia. But once they've arisen, they create institutions. They get institutionalised, and if you want to change classroom practice, it's dependent on all of those other practices that feed it. If you want to change how students learn, it's dependent on all of those other practices that feed it. These practices are all interconnected with one another so that the outputs of teacher education practice are the inputs of teaching practice, say. And the outputs of policy affect the conditions in which teachers can work and so on. So these practices are all affecting one another. Now I'll just zip through. When we look in our project Leading and Learning in classrooms in Western New South Wales, we see influences from outside in the broader world of all of those different kinds of practices alive within the classrooms we work in. I haven't got time to do that. Fritjof Capra says practices, that living things do these things. And I think actually we have evidence that practices do these things. If you're interested, I can send you some more information about that, but where am I? Practices, every practice, teaching, lecturing, the tango, education for sustainability, environmental education, thanks David Suzuki, thanks Canada. All of these practices move around the world, but they only come to endure where there's a niche that makes it possible for them to survive. Here's a niche. Here we see this organism happens to live in these places on the map. It evidently needs this kind of altitude and that kind of rainfall. But why doesn't it exist in these places where it should be possible for it? Is it the pH levels of the soil, or what is it? Is it the rattlesnakes? What's keeping it out of there? We need to know more about that. But what's the niche suitable for the practices of education that we want to pursue? Practices have niches. We need the discursive means for the sayings of a practice. We need new, if we want new ways of thinking about education, we have to have a new language of education. For example, wouldn't it be great if we talked about the social purpose of education, meaning what education is about for the good of humankind, and not just the individual purposes of education, tooling people so that they can participate in the economy and be some kinds of citizenship. I'm nearly there. We need to know that. Yes, niches and practices develop and evolve in interaction with one another. That's a key point there. I'm just trying to get to the end, folks. I've got to kill this before it kills you. And this is the conclusion. If we want to create and secure new practices in new settings, it's not sufficient to secure the professional practice knowledge of practitioners. It's also necessary to create and secure in local sites the practice architectures, those arrangements that support the practice, and to secure the ecological relationships in an ecology of practices that secure the practice in relation to other practices. The theory of practice architecture is a theory of what practices are made of, sayings, doings and relatings and those arrangements. The theory of ecologies of practices is a theory about how practices relate to one another. And it seems to me, if we want to change the world of education, we need to change these kinds of things. It strikes me as weird that, or not so weird, given the practice architectures in which curriculum makers work in Australia today, often taking teachers out of schools and putting them into offices and buildings where they talk to other people, we know what it means to make a curriculum. And so they make a curriculum the way they made curricula years ago, and the way that Erasmus made curricula, by sitting back and thinking about it, the way curriculum have been made from ancient times. We take people out of practice, we put them in a building where they think about practice, and then they come up with a new idea. But when they do it, the traditions of what it means to formulate a curriculum, to make a curriculum, cause them to make curricula that are like the curricula that we've already made. We put them in practice architectures like the ones for making the curricula we made 100 years ago and 150 years ago. So it's not surprising that the results that they come up with are rather similar to the results of curriculum making 100 years ago. In these days, with our problems, with our resources, with our technologies, did we go far enough in creating the practice architectures for the curriculum makers in Australia? They've come up with just another list of content for students to learn. They've produced yet another curriculum, started at just the right time. They've come up with a curriculum just like dozens of curricula before it, and at a time when we could do something very different. I think we need new kinds of practice architectures, and we need new ways of making curricula, as well as new ways of realising them. It seems to me very, very odd that we've plunged ourselves back into the mid-19th century just at a time when you thought we might be getting into the 21st. Thank you.
Thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, and there is some people who have questions or comments at this point in time.
Comments are just as welcome as questions.
Well, I'm interested in your comments on curriculum and very much in agreement. I see a lot of rigid structures and a lot of hoops and expectations and the way things need to be. And I think it's really hampering creativity in curriculum development. And your comment that's, why are we doing this, like what we did 100 years ago, when there was an opportunity for us to do something different. When was the opportunity there, and what was it, and how could it have been done differently?
I studied at Sydney University in the 1960s and 70s and early 70s, and left to go and do a doctorate at Illinois. Then I went to the University of East Anglia, and I started work there with Lawrence Stenhouse in the Centre for Applied Research in Education there. And Lawrence recognised that we now had the best educated teachers that there had ever been, kind of in the history of the world. We had schools that were able to, and theoretically we should have been able to have a profession taking control of its own knowledge. A profession that would be, it's like medicine, you know, admitting people to its own body of knowledge and so on, and that the profession could be a profession of teacher researchers. And I think there was a moment of huge possibility there. Soon after, there was a large recession almost everywhere in the Western world, and we had massive youth unemployment. That youth unemployment, a lot of, as always happens, a huge amount of blame on teachers. You prepared the wrong sort of kids, that's why they're unemployed. Not because there are no jobs, but because you did the wrong job. And that denigration of teachers that became very, very widespread had a massive effect on the way we thought about the profession. Instead of thinking about it as a profession full of possibility, we started thinking about it as a profession constantly in need of rehabilitation and upgrading, and, you know, as constantly failing and needing to be fixed. And that's a very bad way. I think we're once again in that position of 1975 with all of these educated people, and we would be in a position to be liberating the creative professionalism of our whole profession. We need to find structures in which we can make that possible. Those sorts of structures that have existed in some fields more than others, like the English Teachers Associations internationally, very, very strong, very connected with language teaching and so on. But in some other areas, the professional association's not so strong. But we have huge resources that could be strengthening the critical professionalism of teachers and the profession. John Elliott thought, following Lawrence's Stenhouse, that he would start the Classroom Action Research Network, that would be a network for teachers to develop their own knowledge. And because other people wanted to go to the conferences, nurses and others, it ended up becoming the Collaborative Action Research Network, and never coming to life as that teachers association. But it seems to me we need to be able to liberate that kind of critical professionalism again. That's what we need to, I think, is to encourage people to do site-based education development rather than just to pursue the curriculum standards.
Yeah, there's a way then, you're advocating to have curriculum more general so that it can be site-based. So there can be some parameters that then teachers or school districts can take and develop.
Yeah.
Because it seems that it's very specific, you know, the testing and the drive for all of that is precluding any of that happening. It's a crazy kind of environment.
This is
desire, but there's a lot of pressure.
Well, but this is an area, education is an area in which human beings meet one another and develop. And the new public management, which is about targets and so on, and funding, is not very good at speaking that language. And so we're using a language that's foreign to the language of education to manage education. And so we're actually squeezing what's education all out of the way we manage the institutions. This institution included. I mean, we're around the world, we face budget cuts in universities that are changing conditions of our work. And we have great difficulty in understanding how we're to do the work of education that work in the bottom row there, how we can do that work under the changed conditions. But we don't leave it to the teachers to work out how to do it. We tell them what the practice architectures are that we're going to give them to do the work. Anyway, let me just...
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk very much, and I really like this framework that you have. But two comments. One is that I see a contradiction in what you've said regarding the curriculum. On the one hand, you said earlier in your talk that education changes and those practices changes over time, but then you've also referred to the curriculum that we use now, or that the structure of the curriculum is synonymous with the structure of the curriculum 100 years ago. And I don't see how those two things can fit, because in BC anyway, in Dewey's era, we went through an extraordinarily progressive time where changes were made to the curriculum, changes were made to the classroom, and for a variety of reasons during the 1950s that became very conservative again. Same goes for the 1960s, and it became conservative again all around the world. But what I think is most valuable about your framework there is that bottom column that talks about the socio-political. Because in each one of those swings, what's happened in the educational world is that the political world has made the dictates to what happens in the classroom, what happens in the curriculum. And teachers are unlike physicians in that no one tells physicians
Oh,
how
absolutely.
to practice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Even with this latest swing towards 21st century learning, we're doing the same thing again. We're telling teachers what to do and how to do it, rather than leaving it up to teachers. And every time, from my own reading of the history of education in Canada at least, every time that we have swung, it has been a socio-political swing that does not occur in other professions. And I'm wondering if that's just the nature of public schooling.
Well, it's partly because public schooling is part of the public sector and so on.
But why, what I'm wondering is why we have public medicine, for example, why is that not the case? I think there's something unique about education that allows the government, the politicians, the people, the lay people, to say we have as much of a hand in this as everyone else, but we stand back and say, well, let the doctors choose what the doctors do. We don't write them a curriculum. We don't write them a handbook. They write that themselves.
Yep. And that's precisely what I thought when I first started teaching in universities in the early 70s. That's what I thought we're about embarked on. How do we write that curriculum for ourselves? And we confronted the endless being told how to do our jobs. Yeah.
Just a quick question about this. I like this slide as well, and I'm just wondering, it seems like we're in this phase with new and emerging social mobile technologies, that some of these boundaries for educational communities seem to be, transcending national boundaries, local, state, provincial, and I'm wondering how some of these virtual communities and concepts like open school, open schooling, in terms of sharing of universities, is that influencing or does that impact or is it affecting your model or of education in terms of how people are reorganizing themselves as they work?
If I'd been giving the other talk that I didn't give today, I'd have been talking about the tension between schooling and education and the machinery of schooling, the rooms and the textbooks and all of that sort of stuff, is one kind of institutional structure. But I think the internet is changing the world vastly, and it's having, as we all know, huge effects on what goes on inside classrooms because people can get an education anywhere they want to. One of the things I find most exciting is that most social movements are actually educational movements and, in a way, self-educational movements. Education for sustainability is a hugely powerful movement. It's having an impact on schools, but it's having an impact through all sorts of community groups and organisations as well. And those people are educating themselves, not merely schooling themselves, but educating themselves about the issues. And I find in my community in Wagga Wagga, there are various gurus there who know all there is to know about sustainability and have all sorts of clever answers to how we should be living our lives. And these are ordinary folks in the community. They're not university professors or officers in local government or whatever. And so I think these education processes go on all the time and they're kind of unstoppable. And we go on with these education processes, and with the world that we now live in, there are many, many sources. There are dangers, however, in giving away public education and just saying, well, get it all off the net. There are also reasons that we want people to be connecting with one another, possibly through the institution of schoolings, but we want people to be connecting with one another in order that they can build worlds worth living in and work together on the questions of what worlds are worth living in. But I think the new world is one where potentially education can thrive, but we need to be trying to respond to those new advances. I'm not the best person to talk to about how to take advantage of it, but it's obvious that the world has changed and requires those changes.
Thank you so much for passing on all this great knowledge. I really enjoyed your definition of education, and I'm just curious about your definition of knowledge.
Oh, that's a brutal question. I don't think I can do it off the top of my head. Not a really good one. I do, however, think that knowledge covers those three things there: forms of understanding, modes of action, and ways of relating to one another in the world. It's not just the cognitive knowledge up the top there. It also involves those other things, and it's deeply embedded in being embodied on the side of the individual, and it's deeply communal in being, just as it is in language. We meet one another in a sea of language, the logos of language, that carries cognitive knowledge that we can learn, but we meet one another in shared physical time, space, and in social space as well. And so knowledge is always embedded in those things, not just extracted. That's part of the debate about knowledge and representation, the idea that you could have knowledge just up in that forms of understanding, and could be separated, it could be put in books, and we could follow it and understand it and so on. Not a very articulate answer, I'm sorry.
Thanks also for your talk. I think it was really good to see it all laid out in the diagrams, and they did become more and more complex, but I still see those same levels showing up overall. The sayings, the doings, and the relatings.
Yes, yes.
And I was trying to think of us here in this classroom as, how do we, when we get together at a university and we come to a room and we hear someone speak and we talk about education and curriculum and ideas, what are our sayings, doings, and relatings? Because it's sort of like a way of understanding a culture of learners or
Yes,
teachers
yes.
or that sort of thing. And I think that that's really, because we could just do a bunch of sayings, just talk. But by being here, I think there are some doings related to that. We're all here because we want to see some changes or make things better, and we then can use this in some way in how we do relate out in our individual educational